I just don't think there has been nearly enough of a recognition of how cataclysmic this sort of war would be if it broke out. It's not going to be a 3-week war where the Chinese try to invade Taiwan and we try to sink the invasion fleet, and then the losing side says good game and it's over.
Welcome to Shield of the Republic, a podcast sponsored by the Bulwark and the Miller Center of Public Affairs. I'm Eric Edelman, counselor at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, a non-resident fellow at the Miller Center and a Bulwark contributor. My colleague and partner in this enterprise, Eliot Cohen, is traveling, but we're happy today to be joined by a frequent guest, and I think now the most frequent guest, passing Peter Feaver, friend of the podcast and prodigious, prolific historian and author Hal Brands. Hal, welcome to Shield of the Republic again.
Thanks, Eric. And I'll just take a moment at the outset to say that while we live in a world of rivalry, the only competition that really matters is the one between me and Fever. And so I am happy to have reclaimed the lead in that rivalry.
In the strategic competition of guests, I think you win, but I think we're going to have Peter back soon, so we'll keep the competition going. Hal, it's always great to have you, but it's particularly good to have you now in December, because next month in January, Norton will be publishing your new book, The Eurasian Century, Hot Wars, Cold Wars, and the Making of the Modern World, which I'm happy to tell our listeners and viewers is a fantastic book, just absolutely terrific, full of insights into both the history of the 20th century and the emerging history of our own time. I just can't say enough good things about it. Let me make a proposition about what the book is, and tell me if you agree, and then maybe we can unpack some of it. So to me, your book is first an effort to resuscitate the work of three great scholars of geopolitics, in fact, the founders really of the discipline, Halford Mackinder, British geographer, Admiral Mahan, famous U.S. naval officer and mostly author about sea power, and Nicholas Spykman, someone who may be a little less familiar than those other two to our listeners, but a professor of politics at Yale University, who wrote about geopolitics, particularly in the run-up to and during World War II, and who tragically died at a very early age in 1943, but whose writings really presaged a lot of what happened in the Cold War. And you resuscitate these three thinkers and use their work on geopolitics as a lens through which to look at the most important historical events of the 20th and 21st centuries, which is to say the First World War, the Second World War, the Cold War, and the sort of conflicts we find ourselves in now. Is that a fair, essay of what you were trying to accomplish in the book?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think in some ways the book is just kind of an extended riff on the idea. John Maynard Keynes put it best, where he basically said that, every madman who's screaming in the air is actually trying to distill the insight of some scholar intellectual that he read a long time ago. A lot of leaders, some madmen, some not, feature in this story, but the crux of it is that they were all reading in a way from a script that was written by these intellectuals who played a critical role in the founding of the field that we would now call geopolitics. And they all contributed something different. Sometimes they competed with one another. Sometimes they complemented one another. But if you put their insights together, you get a pretty good mental map of the world that unfolded during the 20th century and in fact, the world that we inhabit today.
Walk through, if you would, kind of who these people were. Halford Mackinder, You start really with him. He gives a very important lecture at the Royal Geographical Society in 1904 called The Pivot of History. Alfred Thayer Mahan famously wrote The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, but a number of other books, both historical excursions on sea power, but also some books that were about contemporary American international problems. And then Spykman, of course, writes during World War II about the geopolitics of war. Tell our listeners who these guys were and how they managed to influence people, since intellectuals typically don't influence policy all that much.
They all have interesting personal backgrounds. Let me try to boil it down a little bit. So Mackinder is really Mr. Eurasia. So he was a British geographer, a bit of a polymath who did a bunch of different things. He was involved in the rise of the field of geography in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, at least its rise as a formal academic discipline. He was a public servant as well. He was in Parliament for a number of years. But what really made him famous was the lecture that you mentioned in 1904, The Geographical Pivot of History, in which he basically argued that the coming era in international politics was going to be dominated by clashes between Eurasian land powers. And he had Russia, maybe in league with Germany mostly in mind, that would try to dominate Eurasia and then use its resources and use its location as a platform to project power globally. And they would be resisted by offshore powers. And being a Brit, he had Britain mostly in mind, that would work with endangered states around the margins of Eurasia to try to prevent this from happening. Because the point he made was that if any single state or coalition of states dominated Eurasia's geography and resources, it would be by far the strongest actor in the world. It would be able to build world-beating navies. And so no country anywhere would be secure. And right there, you have sort of the thing that motivated the United States in World War I and World War II. Certainly was on the mind of George Kennan and other strategists during the Cold War. And a lot of what the U.S. And first Britain and then the U.S. have done over the 20th and early 21st centuries is basically try to keep Eurasia fragmented. He was a contemporary of Mahan, who was sort of an odd creature. He was a naval officer who was apparently terrible at handling ships and really didn't like being at sea that much. He was much more of an intellectual, and he kind of finally found his calling when he ended up at the Naval War College, which had been newly established just before that in the late 19th century. And, Mahan wrote faster than most people can speak. And so he must have churned out a couple dozen books and, hundreds of articles over basically the 25 years between 1890 or so and the beginning of World War I. And I think the messages were basically twofold. They were both aimed at an American audience. And message one was, you got to stop thinking about oceans as moats. Oceans are highways. They can carry your goods and commerce all over the world, but they can also carry enemy fleets, perhaps even enemy armies to your shore. And so this mattered for the United States because at a time of intensifying international competition, the U.S. was going to have to ditch the assumption that the Atlantic and the Pacific would ensure its security. They would only conduce to America's security if the U.S. developed the naval power to prevent hostile states from commanding those oceans. And that related to the second piece of advice that Mahan offered, which was basically that the U.S. needed to shift from a hemispheric to a global outlook. And he said, look, the Monroe Doctrine was fine for its era, kind of the early, middle, late 19th century. But now we live in a world where aggression is intensifying. States are becoming more ambitious. There's more of a possibility that some Eurasian state, he focused a lot on Russia at first, then started thinking about Japan and Germany, could dominate some part of that area and again, use it as a platform for global power projection. And so the U.S. was going to need to work with allies, and he eventually came to have the U.K. mostly in mind. And so in a way, he is a predictor of the Anglo-American special relationship to make sure that the old world doesn't come out of balance. And then Spykman, or Spykman, different people pronounce his last name in different ways, was a Dutch-American strategist. He actually got his training first as a journalist and then as an academic sociologist. And as the world fell apart in the 1930s, he basically shifted from studying the role of power in domestic society, which is what most sociologists do, to studying the role of power in international society. And he, I think, had two really important contributions to framing the way Americans view the world in a couple of books that he wrote while World War II was in progress. The first idea was in some ways an inversion of Mackinder. And so Spykman said, yeah, you don't want a country dominating Eurasia, but the danger doesn't come from sort of the vast heartland, what Mackinder had called the pivot area of Eurasia, a significant part of which is covered by permafrost. It comes from the more economically dynamic, industrialized regions at the margins of Eurasia, East Asia, Western Europe, sort of the rimlands, as Spykman called them. And he pointed out that in World War I and World War II, what had happened was not that a heartland power, a country from the interior of Eurasia, had sort of pushed outward. It was that you had countries at the margins of Eurasia, Germany in World War I, Germany and Japan in World War II, that attempted conquest on land and by sea. And finally, and I'll bring it to a close here, his second contribution was he explained to Americans why they couldn't tolerate a world in which Japan and Germany or any other group of Eurasian aggressors was successful. Because he basically pointed out that once that happened, the U.S. would lose control of the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. It would be separated from South America, at least South America south of the bulge of Brazil. It would be subject to blockades and other forms of economic warfare. And once it was weakened enough, its enemies would close in for the kill. And so this was an argument not simply for intervention in World War II, although he eventually became convinced that was necessary, but why the U.S. needed to stay in Eurasia after the war was over to prevent hostile powers from commanding its coasts once again.
Yeah, I mean, again, not to oversimplify, but Mackinder, as he writes in 1904 about the world island, the emergence of Eurasia, is got railroads in mind, as the Trans-Siberian Railroad is being built and Russian power is expanding into the Pacific. Of course, a year later, that ran into a bit of a roadblock with Japan in the Russo-Japanese War. Mahan, of course, arguing, as you say, about sea power and transoceanic navies. Spykman, in a sense, is talking about both sea power and air power, because air power has become, an important factor in warfare by the time he is writing actively as well. And I mean, these ideas, as you point out, they're not just sort of idle speculation by academics scribbling in the ivory tower. These ideas all have a lot of currency with important political figures. So, I mean, Wilson ultimately comes to the conclusion that the U.S. cannot tolerate a Europe dominated by Germany. FDR very much has these ideas in mind as he's approaching World War II, trying to support the Brits without running afoul of popular opinion in the United States, which is, for reasons you explain very well in the book, turned very much against sort of interventionism in Europe's affairs, or in Asia's affairs, for that matter. And it's clearly, as you point out, Spykman, his thoughts clearly are reflected in the kinds of things that Truman says, for instance, in the Truman Doctrine speech, and that Dean Acheson says as he is putting together the NATO alliance, etc. One of the things that they conclude, and all of these folks do, and that you write about, is that the costs of deterring war, while expensive, in the end up being much cheaper than actually waging war, which is, the kind of terrible wages of the 20th century. And so part of your discussion here is about how, as these ideas take hold after World War II, the United States is able to play a role that allows it to, win the Cold War, as it were, without firing a shot in the end of the day, after many trials and tribulations, as opposed to having been late to the game in 1917 and in 1941, and having had to pay a terrible price. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so one way of thinking about this is that it is ultimately the United States that breaks this cycle of catastrophic Eurasian conflict. And so while they differed on the details, the three individuals we've talked about, all understood that you were likely to see big titanic clashes over Eurasia. And of course, that's exactly what happened in the first half of the 20th century. And in both cases, what became clear was that there was no combination of old world countries, no combination of Eurasian powers that could hold the balance against the most aggressive illiberal states, whether that was Germany in World War One, the Axis in World War II, or eventually the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And so in both of those earlier instances, the US is eventually dragged into these conflicts because once you have a Eurasia that is consumed by war, that insecurity invariably radiates outward into the adjoining oceans. And the US comes in, and even though it pays a lesser price to sort of restore the balance than the French did in World War One or the Russians and the British did in World War II, it's a very heavy price by American standards and by any standard. Hundreds of thousands of personnel are killed, all of the domestic dislocations that come with war. And so eventually American policymakers take Spykman's advice. They take Mackinder's advice. And in fact, we know that George Kennan, when he was teaching at the National War College in 1947, read some of their pieces, and they informed the lectures that he gave and the counsel that he gave to help frame America's Cold War grand strategy. And basically what the U.S. decided was that it would be cheaper to anchor alliances that protect the margins of Eurasia, right? They basically protect the rimlands, as Spykman would have had it. And they do two things. So they prevent the bad guys from pushing outwards to the coasts of Eurasia and into the adjoining oceans. And so if you look at where America's Cold War alliances were located, it's no coincidence that the most important ones were NATO, which holds down Western Europe and the North Atlantic, and the string of mostly bilateral security pacts in the Western Pacific that sort of block communist access to the open Pacific. But they also tamp down on the historical tensions within these regions, right? And so NATO essentially forces France and West Germany to get along and provides the climate of security in which they can do that. And the costs of this sort of engagement were very heavy. And I'm not just talking about the financial costs of stationing hundreds of thousands of American service members semi-permanently in Eurasia, which is something the U.S. had never done before and did for decades after World War II, and some of them remain there today. It was also the cost of risking nuclear war, of coming up with escalation strategies that would allow you to deter the Soviet Union through the threatened use of nuclear weapons, because even with U.S. troops deployed in Western Europe, you couldn't be sure that you could defeat them in conventional terms. And we look back on this now, and we look at crises over Berlin or other hotspots. You read the rhetoric of John Foster Dulles, who talks about the need to be willing to go to the brink to deter aggression and coercion. And we think, like, God, these people must be insane. But of course, they were living in a world where the Eurasian balance of power had broken down twice before, and they understood how serious that was for the United States. And so they understood that running the costs of preserving the peace was ultimately better than paying the costs of having to fight the next World War.
Yeah, and I mean, you do a beautiful job of laying all of that out. Um, you also talk about the breakdown in the 30s of the global order, and the rise of tariffs, the rise of kind of governments that were focused on economic, uh, autarky and sort of self-sufficiency. Mussolini, um, uh, Hitler's Germany, of course, the same for Imperial Japan. And there's a very arresting sentence um, in your book where you talk about economic warfare augured military warfare, because the breakdown of trade and the Great Depression obviously intensified a lot of these conflicts. Um, Seems like a timely conversation, given the fact that the president-elect is planning to, depending on what day he's talking, slap on a 20% tariff or 60% tariff or 10% more on China for, whatever reason. And we already have governments, fragmenting over this. I mean, I've seen that the deputy prime minister and finance minister in Canada, Chrystia Freeland, has resigned. And not that I think we're going to end up at war with Canada necessarily, nor do I think we're going to end up with Canada as the 51st or 51st and 52nd states. But talk a little bit about the breakdown of the international economic order and how it contributed to the impending conflict in the 30s.
I think there were a few different things going on here. One was that the lesson that a number of countries, particularly the countries that would become the aggressors in World War II, took away from World War One, was that there was no substitute for scale, and there was no substitute for the physical control of the lands and the economic resources you needed, because the Germans obviously had observed this intimately. The Japanese saw the same thing. They saw how the Brits and their allies had basically tried to starve Germany into submission, and had killed several 100,000 civilians in the process of doing so. And so it became clear that when things really got rough, you couldn't rely on the normal functioning of the international trading system. You had to physically own the foodstuffs that you needed, for instance. And so that explains a lot in terms of Hitler's ambitions to make conquests in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, which he viewed as sort of the future breadbasket of a greater Germany, and Japan's moves first in Manchuria and then elsewhere on the mainland of Asia, and then reaching down into Southeast Asia in the 1930s and early 1940s. But what also happened, of course, was that the Great Depression made everything worse. And so the Great Depression leads to a seizing up of the international trade system, which just reinforces the message that Japanese and German leaders were already taking away from World War One. If international markets were not going to be available to Germany or Japan, well, then you had to assemble a big bad empire with a huge internal market, because that was the only way you could maintain your prosperity and the only way that you could compete on a global scale. Now, as you mentioned, Eric, obviously we don't want to overdraw the parallel, but I think kind of the key takeaway is that the renegotiation of economic relationships with Mexico or Canada or China or whoever is one thing. But when international economic relations go in a very cutthroat direction, international political and diplomatic relations tend to go in the same way, because what you're ultimately talking about is the economic survival of countries in an increasingly anarchic system. And once you start going down that road, you can get into a place where you're talking about much more serious military and security challenges as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's an anarchic and much more competitive system than it was, for instance, 15 or 20 years ago, where people are thinking about things in terms of great power competition. I mean, I think it also is worth recalling that the U.S. played a not so helpful role here in the 30s, with first with the Smoot-Hawley tariff, and then with FDR in June of 1933, deciding that he needed to, in order to rebuild the U.S. economy that he was taking over from Hoover, he needed to do some things that would run counter to kind of international cooperation to ease the depression, and he sort of torpedoes the London Economic Conference that was called to do that. So there's a U.S. role in all this as well. It's not just the sort of bad guys, wanting to be more autonomous in the international economy.
Yeah, just to put a finer point on it, Smoot-Hawley was devastating to Japan, just utterly devastating. I think Japanese exports dropped by something like half in the year after those tariffs were imposed, and so in a sense, it was U.S. action that helped send Japan down the path of economic and military aggression. But by the way, this also illustrates one of the great achievements of the U.S.-led international order since World War II, because one of the things the United States has achieved in anchoring a relatively liberal, open, free world economy during the Cold War was making sure that countries like West Germany and Japan had access to the markets and the resources that they needed to thrive. And so, just to put very bluntly, you no longer had to go on these homicidal rampages to ensure your own prosperity. You could thrive within the American-led system, even if you were militarily a relatively weak state.
And hence, you don't get one of the things that people were very fearful of, both after World War II and after the end of the Cold War, which is the reemergence of Germany and Japan as armed, military threats to the safety and security and prosperity of their neighbors. I mean, we tend to forget that at the end of the Cold War, I think it was Mrs. Thatcher who said, "I love Germany so much that I want them to be two of them." She and Francois Mitterrand both, it was only 40 years. It was within their living memory, that Germany had, been attacking them. So the strength of that system that you just described is really incredibly powerful.
Yeah, you could fill the bookshelf behind me with books that were written in the early 1990s predicting that a unified Germany and a more independent Japan were going to be real trouble for the international system after the Cold War ended. And of course, they weren't. I mean, our biggest complaint about Germany these days is that it doesn't spend enough on defense. And the reason was that
Same with Japan.
Same with Japan, right? And the reason was that there was no opportunity for these countries to engage in revisionism because the U.S. stayed planted in Europe and East Asia after the Cold War ended, and there was no need because they were doing so fantastically well within an international system that was led by the United States.
Although, and full disclosure, I had some personal involvement in this. It didn't just happen by accident. There was conscious thought given to the fact that the United States at the end of the Cold War, for instance, when people were calling for a peace dividend and total U.S. disarmament, we don't need our ally alliances anymore. The famous or infamous 1992 defense planning guidance, which you write about in your book and which I've written about, as you know, consciously said the United States needs to stay the linchpin of this system, and we don't want Germany and Japan to renationalize their defense and then become a threat to the security. We didn't actually mention Germany and Japan, explicitly in the document, but it was clear that we wanted to maintain the system so that people weren't tempted to become a threat to the peace and security of their neighborhoods.
Yeah, and it's probably not a coincidence either that the president of the United States at that time was a World War II veteran. Of course, George H.W. Bush had been shot down over the Pacific. Or I guess he'd had to bail out over the Pacific and sort of narrowly escaped with his life. And so he had firsthand experience with what happens when the Eurasian balance of power falls apart. And he was determined that that wouldn't happen again, that the U.S. wouldn't sort of retrench after the Cold War in the way it had retrenched after World War I.
Right. Another point that I think you make very effectively in the book, and which bears on contemporary events as well, is that when World War II broke out, because of the interpenetration of all of these crises that had taken place in Europe and Asia in the 1930s, the invasion of Manchuria by Japan, the various crises of Anschluss and Munich, and then ultimately the invasion of Poland. All of these things made it almost overdetermined that the Second World War would not remain, a regional war, or that it would be separated regional wars. It ended up becoming a global war. And I just got done, as you know, co-chairing with former Representative Jane Harman the National Defense Strategy Commission that reviewed the 2022 Biden NDS. You were a big part of the commission work that went on in the 2018 Trump NDS. And we made, I think, a pretty similar point about our contemporary situations. Hard to imagine a dust-up in the Indo-Pacific, given the relationships with North Korea, Russia, and the PRC, not to mention Iran's role, that this would not become a global conflict as well. Can you talk a little bit about that, and both in the World War II, Cold War context that you write about, but also looking, at today's situation?
I think the strongest parallel is between the situation that FDR confronted in 1940 and 1941 and the situation that the U.S. faces today, where then as now, there was general agreement that a challenge on one side of Eurasia was the biggest threat, right? And so most people agreed that Nazi Germany was the bigger threat, especially once it had defeated France in 1940. Japan was a problem, but it was not as severe. Just in the same way that I think most people believe, in Washington at least, that China represents the biggest threat today. But in both cases, the problem was that wasn't the only thing happening. You had regional crises in other places as well. The balance was being tested in other places. And what resulted, and I think what FDR accurately understood, was that when the system gets really highly pressurized and it's being tested on multiple fronts, regional challenges can take on global implications. And so for FDR, this manifested in the fact that he was willing to run a very high risk of war with Japan in the second half of 1941 by imposing the oil embargo and the asset freezes, and ultimately rejecting a potential settlement of the China affair, even though his military advisors, including George Marshall, were screaming, "This is crazy. We've got to be focused on the threat from Europe." And I think what FDR understood is that there was a certain interlinkage of these crises. And so by the fall of 1941, he was really worried that if the U.S. basically sold out the Chinese government and the Chinese government collapsed under the weight of Japanese aggression, that would free Japan to turn its attention to the Soviet Union and might knock the Soviet Union out of the war after it had been invaded by Nazi Germany, and so on and so forth. And so sort of, pressures and decisions were ricocheting wildly around the walls of the international system at this point. And I think in some ways that's a similar challenge to what the U.S. faces today. I agree in principle that China represents the greatest threat to the international order in the coming decade, let's say. But that doesn't dispose of the question of what do you do about Russia's war in Ukraine? Because the reality is that is where the system is being tested most severely right now. And it is actually a place where you have a quasi-alliance of Eurasian revisionists, something that Mackinder would have recognized, that are engaged in a test of strength against the democratic world. It's not just Russia and Ukraine going at it. Ukraine is being backed by most of the advanced democracies in the U.S. alliance system. Russia is being backed by North Korea, Iran, and China in different ways and to different degrees. And so if Russia is successful in Ukraine, if it succeeds in imposing a very unfavorable peace, or eventually in overthrowing the government in Kyiv, that's going to have global implications as well. And so it's just another one of the ways in which these Eurasian struggles in different regions become very interwoven.
Yeah, and it's a point you make extremely well in the book, and which I will confess personally I had not given adequate thought to. You talk about how everybody knows that FDR thought it was absolutely crucial to keep the Soviet Union in the war. We have big lend lease. We provide enormous amounts of materiel to the Russians to keep them in the fight. I mean, they're paying a huge price, obviously, in lives lost, but they couldn't have stayed in the fight without the flow of the Persian aid corridor through Iran, which supplied them with trucks and uh, planes and equipment and petrol and all these other things. But you make the point that FDR also understood, although he was the sort of progenitor of the Europe First strategy, that he knew that he couldn't completely ignore East Asia, and that keeping China in the fight against Japan, as you just mentioned earlier, was absolutely crucial to ultimate success. And I think there is, as you noted, there is um, a relevance to what we're kind of looking at now, which brings me to kind of the next point I wanted to get at, actually, Hal. You talk about we're entering the second Eurasian century, and that second Eurasian century has been marked essentially by the rise of China, by the emergence of the PRC as a global power, and one that is putting been engaged in a huge military buildup, both of conventional forces, now of nuclear forces, as you point out as well. And you make an important point that I'd love to hear you talk about a little more, which is that there's been a belated but welcome bipartisan consensus that, as you just said a minute ago, China is what the 2022 NDS calls the pacing challenge for the United States. Not the only one, but in the long term, probably the most serious and important one. But you say there's not been a bipartisan execution of this strategy in an effective way yet. Could talk a little bit about that and how you came to that view.
Well, in some ways, there's good news. Over the past 8 years, 2 U.S. presidential administrations have basically said that the U.S. needs to get serious about competing with China. And 2 U.S. presidential administrations with congressional support have done a number of constructive things to impede China's access to high-end semiconductors and the stuff that's used to manufacture them, to shore up America's alliances in the Indo-Pacific and to kind of knit them together in a more significant way, even though one of the biggest weaknesses of America's position in that region is that there is no single multilateral, an attack on one is an attack on all type alliance in the way that there is in Europe. And I could go down the list of constructive things that I think the Trump and Biden administrations have done. But I think there are two big glaring holes in U.S. strategy that neither Republicans nor Democrats have been willing to tackle. And one is the absence of a sort of positive vision of trade policy and economic policy in the Indo-Pacific that would tie countries in the region more closely to the U.S. and to each other, make them less dependent on China. We once had something that was meant to do this. It was called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and there has been a bipartisan flight from that agreement, unfortunately. The second thing is really getting serious about the level of military preparation that is necessary to ensure that every time Xi Jinping looks at Taiwan and looks at the military balance in the Taiwan Strait, he says, you know what, today's not a good day to do this because I think I might lose. I don't mean to denigrate what's been done. I think the Pentagon has done some interesting work with new operational concepts. I think it's great that the U.S. has gotten access to more bases and other sites in the Philippines and in a variety of other places. Like all this is really good, in some cases historic stuff, but I just don't think there's any denying that the balance of power has shifted dramatically in China's favor in the Western Pacific over the past couple of decades. And candidly, there's no denying that the U.S. just isn't ready for a war over Taiwan. We're not ready in terms of ammunition stockpiles. We're not ready in terms of the state of our defense industrial base and our ability to replace ships or planes or submarines that are lost in the opening phases of the conflict. We're not intellectually ready either, in the sense that I just don't think there has been nearly enough of a recognition of how cataclysmic this sort of war would be if it broke out. It's not going to be a 3-week war where the Chinese try to invade Taiwan and we try to sink the invasion fleet, and then the losing side says good game and it's over. It's a war that's going to last long, as most wars between industrialized great powers do. It's a war that's going to sprawl geographically. It's going to go up and down the Western Pacific and probably into other regions. And it is a war that's going to have very high risks of nuclear escalation from the outset, because you'll have two nuclear armed great powers going at it. And I think there are some people in Washington who are very serious and very sober about this. But I think in general, it has been hard for the seriousness of the issue to break through. And so we're still behind the curve on the deterrence part of the equation.
Yeah, I agree with that. And obviously, the NDS Commission report that we just issued comes to a very similar conclusion. I am somewhat encouraged that, Senator Wicker, the incoming chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, is very seized with precisely these issues that you've talked about, including the fragility of our defense industrial base. And I would note that Senate Majority Leader McConnell, soon to be former Senate Majority Leader McConnell, but who will be taking over the chairmanship of the Senate Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, which is, one of the most important perches from which to influence the kinds of issues you were just talking about, has just written a big article in Foreign Affairs, which argues against specifically the kind of retrenchment that you've talked about in the book in multiple eras that crippled the U.S. ability to deal with this. So I too have some hope, but what's missing, I think, is we're on the cusp of all these technological changes, all of which you talk about, autonomy, artificial intelligence, microelectronics, quantum computing, etc. And you do talk about a period in the 70s and early 80s when we came to grips with our conventional inferiority vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, at a period when they were reaching parity in nuclear weaponry, and which we resolved essentially with what was done under the Carter administration with Secretary Harold Brown and his undersecretary equivalent, the director of Defense Research and Engineering at the time, Bill Perry, later Secretary of Defense under Bill Clinton, which was to procure stealthy aircraft and precision-guided munitions, which were then procured in at scale during the Carter-Reagan defense buildup, and were put in service of a specific warfighting concept or series of concepts, which was air-land battle, assault breaker, follow-on forces attack for NATO, which we would then go out and routinely exercise in front of the Soviets, which was a huge deterrent to them actually ever, coming across the Fulda Gap in Central Europe to try and, launch a fait accompli to smash and grab Western Europe, in 2 or 3 days. That still seems to me to be missing, what we haven't been able to accomplish.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I mean, I think that the key phrase you used in describing the fruits of the 1970s and 1980s technological revolutions were fielded at scale, right? Because what we learn from the 20th century is that, yes, war is about technological innovation, but great power war, for the most part, is still a matter of mass, right? It was mass that determined the outcomes of World War I and World War II. Mass married to interesting operational concepts like the use of carrier task forces in the Pacific and so on and so forth. But mass made all the difference. And I think we're getting a refresher in that in Ukraine right now.
Yeah. You also have a very arresting, one of the book's real great contributions, I think, is to deal with this issue of this emerging group of countries, the PRC, Russia, North Korea, Iran, that have been engaged in a ever tightening web of collaboration, mostly not for good, mostly for ill. Other people have called it the axis of upheaval or the axis of malcontents, but you've described it as fortress Eurasia, that they've created this sort of knot in the center of in what Mackinder would have called the world island, um, and that we need to pay attention to this because, as you point out, in the 20th century, this was a region that produced, again, a very arresting phrase, geopolitical super predators, as you describe them. Talk a little bit about Fortress Eurasia and how should we think about that?
This is really one of the things that keeps me up at night, in the sense that you have this thickening web of relationships between the countries that are most aggressively challenging the international order: Iran, Russia, China, North Korea. I think Americans sometimes have trouble making sense of these relationships because they don't, when we think of alliances, we think of our alliances, which are highly formalized and, come along with formal defense guarantees and professions of solidarity and so on and so forth. And these relationships just don't look the same. And so we look at them and we say, well, they don't look the same as ours. They must not really be alliances. Maybe we don't need to worry about them. They're transactional and so on and so forth. But they actually do a lot to destabilize the international system. They encourage disruptive military innovation. One of the things I think U.S. policymakers worry a lot right now is, look at all the advanced technology that Russia is trading away to North Korea in particular to get its aid in Ukraine. They reduce the isolation that aggressive states might otherwise face. I don't think there's any way Russia could have sustained its war in Ukraine for so long without the military aid that's gotten from Iran and North Korea, and the economic aid, the economic relationship it's had from China. These relationships make it easier for the bad guys to create instability on certain fronts because they create stability on others. I sometimes think that the best analog for the Sino-Russian relationship is the Nazi-Soviet pact, which was basically a non-aggression pact that allowed both of those countries to perpetrate lots of aggression within their respective spheres of influence. One of the reasons that Putin can throw his entire army at Ukraine is that he knows he's got a secure border with China, which not that long ago was the most heavily militarized frontier in the world. And just two further points on this. One of the reasons I call it Fortress Eurasia is because geography actually does matter here. The fact that the three of these countries share borders: Russia, North Korea, China, and Iran is linked to Russia by an inland sea, which is basically off limits to the U.S. Navy, means that they can do illicit military transfers more easily. It means that they can evade sanctions more easily. This isn't like the Axis during World War II, where Japan and Germany had to travel halfway across the world to get to each other. The fact that there's a certain proximity here really does aid them. And the second point I would make is that these relationships have developed faster and gone farther than anyone would have predicted. You can't show me one person who predicted that North Korea and Russia were going to seal a formal military alliance back when the Ukraine war started, and then that North Korea would deploy troops in a war that was being fought in Europe. I don't think people predicted the scale of the dual-use trade that emerged between Russia and China, and so on and so forth. And so, we don't just need to look at where these relationships are now. We need to look at where they could go in the future. And I fear the answer is they're not going anywhere good.
Yeah, I mean, 2 years ago or so, Frank Miller and I testified to the Senate Armed Services Committee about the so-called three-body problem, the fact that China is emerging as a nuclear peer of the United States, which gives us a novel challenge, which is facing two nuclear peers. We've never faced that in our history, as you've written about, actually. And we raised the question of, we need to start thinking in our own nuclear planning about how do we think about joint, Sino-Russian, nuclear attack on the United States. And, people looked at us like, well, that's sort of science fiction. That's not going to happen. I happened to be testifying this past summer on the NDS Commission report, and Senator Kaine raised the fact that we've now seeing signs of joint, Sino-Russian long-range nuclear-capable bomber patrols, in our air defense information zone up near Alaska. So it's rapidly developing in ways that could be very, as you say, very destructive, very untoward for us. The book has, I don't want to belabor it because we're running low on time, a number of very arresting conclusions that I urge our listeners to read the book and go through them themselves. But that ideology and geopolitics are inextricable now, which I think a few years ago people might not have agreed with, but I think most people now realize that the U.S. is an absolutely crucial balancer. It's been a late balancer in the past, but it has to balance these forces in Eurasia. That our primacy is going to be contested, although it still exists, and that we're going to have to rely more than ever on allies in what you term, I think correctly, a kind of variable geometry of different relationships, and that this is going to be a very, very messy period ahead of us, and very trying and taxing, both psychologically and literally, for us to be able to get our hands around the problem. Obviously, you finished writing this book before the election results were in, before President-elect Trump was. It was clear that he would be returning to office. Plus, a lot of other things have happened. We've had this massive disruption of Iran's proxies in the Middle East, the collapse of the Assad regime, and which is essentially the collapse of a joint Russo-Iranian project that goes back a decade. Anything has happened since then that would change your views on anything in the book, or just reinforce them?
Well, a lot has happened, and this is a reminder that shooting at a moving target is never easy. I'll say two things. One is that in the Middle East, things have gotten better since I had my last crack at the book, which I think was in August, in the sense that the Israelis have just knocked the snot out of Iran and the axis of resistance since then. And we are not out of the woods in that region. Iran still has a very well advanced nuclear program, which is going to cause serious challenges for President Trump and U.S. allies and partners in the region. But at the very least, that threat to a key region of Eurasia has been beaten back a little bit since the middle of 2024, and that's a good thing. The thing that has happened, I think, that is very bad is that, just candidly, Ukraine is in a much worse situation than it was when I started drafting the book, and even when I sort of finished the first draft of it. We don't need to go into this at great length, but I think Ukraine is entering a period where there's a real danger that its position could erode significantly over the next 6 months or so. And it's going to impose some very hard choices on President Trump, who you mentioned. He wants to negotiate an end to the war. In principle, I don't necessarily think that's a bad idea. In practice, getting Putin to end a war that he believes he's winning is going to require the U.S. to exert a heck of a lot of pressure, economically, diplomatically, maybe militarily, on Russia. And I'm not sure that the incoming administration, and particularly the president himself, fully appreciate how hard and potentially how dangerous that's going to be.
Well, we could go on because there's so much in this book that we could talk for another 2 hours. But Hal, it's been great having you on Shield of the Republic. I want to remind the listeners and viewers, the book is The Eurasian Century. If you want to start your year off right, you're going to want to read this. It'll be out in January. What's the publication date?
January 14th.
January 14th. So, perfect to read over the long weekend in the middle of January. I encourage people to order their copies now. Hal, thank you so much for coming back to us on Shielded Republic, and I know we'll want to have you back again at some point in the future so that you can either keep up or surpass Peter Fever.
Thanks, Eric. I always enjoy the conversation.